Hi students, welcome to Year 11 Biology and Module 3, Biological Diversity. This is video number 9 and we're going to be continuing our look at natural selection, this time in the context of the Australian biota. So in this video we're going to just have a little bit of a talk through some secondary sources and also some of the work that was carried out by Darwin to support the theory of evolution in the context of the Australian flora and fauna. So there's a couple of important things, and this is obviously way too big an area for us to cover in a single video, and it's something that you're going to have a look at in class time. So what I want to do is just summarize some of the key points that are part of the story of natural selection in Australia, and to then set you off on some separate activities which you'll have a look at. So Australia has what we call a Gondwanan heritage, and that is basically meaning that Australia was once part of a southern supercontinent called Gondwana, which was made up of Antarctica, Australia obviously, Antarctica, South America, Africa, and also India. And these were originally joined together. And so we find, as part of our study of this southern supercontinent, that there are a number of rocks and also fossils that show us a Gondwanan distribution. That is, that existed on each of these different continents. And they included things like Glossopteris, so a species of plant that you can't imagine moving between the continents in their current locations, so therefore they must have been at some point much closer together. The separation that occurred from this supercontinent actually occurred gradually, and Australia was last to separate from Antarctica around 55 million years ago. And that's fairly important because that's the time when we had isolation. That's the time when the Australian biota, the Australian plants and animals, were able to develop in isolation. And one of the important things that Darwin and also Wallace identified is this important idea of isolation. And through isolation, we have adaptive radiation. And that is where we have a continent where there are a number of different types of ecological niches to be filled, then if there are species there that are moving into each of these different niches, they're going to have different requirements, or natural selection is going to select different types of structures or behaviors or physiologies that are going to best suit each of those different types of organisms in those particular niches. So that's what we see when we start to look at the history of the development of the Australian flora and fauna. Titan Education provided a really nice overview, and one of the things that we do have to do is look at some secondary sources. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is an example of a secondary source which gives you a couple of important pieces of information. In column A, we have a time scale going from recent to 500 million years ago. In column B, we have the key events in the formation of the Australian continent. So you can see if we go far enough back, all of the continents were joined in one big supercontinent called Pangaea. Subsequently, that continent split into a northern Laurasia and southern supercontinents, and Gondwana is the southern one, and that's the one that we were in Australia part of. As you look at the continued breakup of these continents, you notice that we get down to that time frame we looked at in the last slide, which is that the separation of Australia happened quite late, and it happened from Antarctica last. And at that particular time, we had rising sea levels and, again, parts of Australia covered by sea. And as we continue to sort of move up into more recent times, you can see the separation from Antarctica and the drifting of Australia further north, which did change some of the climate. So C is the column that's the most important one for us here if we're trying to understand how the Australian biota changed over time. So we start down here with the plants that were available So the land plants were dominated by club mosses, lichens, and then the seed ferns, which is our Glossopteris. That was the little fossil on the previous slide. In the 65 to 160 million years ago, that's partly overlapping with the age of the dinosaurs. So we do find dinosaur fossils in Australian rocks. In fact, there's quite an interesting and unique group of dinosaurs that we found from Australian rocks. And then as Australia continued to drift away from the Gondwanan continents and north, we find changes in the climate and consequent changes in the plants in particular, and then obviously the animal species that those plants supported as Australia continued to move away on its own, developed in isolation, and drifted further and further towards the north. So you can see one of the things that we've gone from is temperate rainforests predominating through to these sclerophyll forests, these drier, hard leaf plants, and think probably the most classic Australian, or one of the classic Australian plants, which is the eucalypt. And they have very hard, very crunchy leaves. And that's characteristic of these types of environments where rainfall is much lower and not your classic rainforest plants. So part of what we want to do with our secondary source information is we want to extract this sort of information, see what's there, help us build up a little bit of a time frame, and also try and work through, because if we're going to analyze this under Darwinian natural selection, we have to look for the selective pressures. We have to look at what is it about the environment that may be changing, and both in a biotic and an abiotic sense. And so what effect is that having on the Australian biota? What plants are dominating? Is there a change in the dominant plants? What animals are dominating? Is there a change in the dominant animals? One of the things that we do find that we will look at a little bit later is the Australian megafauna. So there is evidence in rocks of very, very large organisms, much larger than the marsupials that we see today, that did exist on the Australian continent, and could only have done so if the plants that were available for them, the food sources that were available for them, were more abundant and more suited to them than they are today. Why they've become extinct is something that we'll explore later on in the course, but this is what we're doing when we're trying to track through these changes in Australian biota. So let's look at two important components of the Australian biota in a little bit more detail. Now you'll need to start to identify some specific examples of Australian flora, and the two kind of key groups are the Proteaceae. So we have an example here, the Banksia, and also the Myrtaceae. And they are the two very important plant groups in Australia. They're the native plants. They're ones that are seen every time you go on bushwalks, and they dominate the Australian environment. Their characteristics are a small and hard leaf. Usually they're not soft, juicy leaf plants. And they are, the eucalypts in particular, often full of oils. One of the other things that's been very interesting in looking at Australian flora is how the effect of fire has developed hand in hand with some of these different types of plants. In the fires that occurred early in 2020, there was devastation that occurred everywhere. And I don't know if you can kind of see from here, but one of the great things about a lot of Australian plants is their ability to regenerate very quickly after fire. So you can even see areas where there's blackened stumps, blackened trunks of trees, and you can see some of the little epicormic buds, the little growth regions that have sprouted through the black bark and are producing new growth, so that the plants can regrow and recolonize. And that's one of the things that we find a lot. In fact, there's certain types of species that really do rely on fire as part of their life cycle and regeneration. The southern beech is one of the important plants as well. That's Nothofagus. That's the one that's at the top of this list. And also we've seen, and hopefully if you look in a little more detail through that kind of table that I put on the last slide, you'll notice that there's been some significant changes in climate, and climate produces those abiotic factors that affect our net primary production, that is the growth of plants. What type of plants are going to be in a particular environment, very heavily tied to things like temperature range, water availability, perhaps also nutrients. And these are the factors that we need to have a look at in terms of which types of plants are going to dominate the environment. Because the plants provide food for the animals, we also need to look at how we've had an adaptive radiation of marsupials. And they certainly are our dominant native species. So we've got a huge range of different marsupials, and one of the interesting tasks you'll have a look at is to look at the parallels, evidence of what we'll call convergent evolution, where we see particular organisms filling particular niches. And that happens a lot in Australia. We've got honey eaters, we've got ant eaters, we've got marsupial moles, we've got little marsupial rodents, we've got hunters, we've got specialist. I guess if you're looking for parallels, the koala is probably a good parallel with a sloth. It does very little all day, and it eats food that is not particularly nutritious, doesn't produce a huge amount of energy for it. We've got grazers like the kangaroos. So we've got a huge range of different types of marsupials that have filled different niches within the Australian environment. And they've often done that because they haven't had to compete with the eutherian or placental equivalents that have been present on other continents. There's also an example, a diprotodon, which is the one that's in this little photo here, and it is one of the megafauna, one of those big beasts that we find fossil evidence of, that was obviously around when the continent was able to support much larger animals with obviously food that was much richer and much greater in terms of its energy capacity. So this is just a very quick overview. Obviously, the Australian Biota in previous biology courses got its own topic. We can only give it one video, and there's a huge amount that we can go into, and we will have a look at that in terms of some of the parallels and convergent evolution. But Australia is such a unique continent in terms of its flora and its fauna, and it's well worth having a good look to give yourself some good examples of each type. Thanks for watching.